Welcome to Michigan's Great Beer State Podcast, brought to you by the Michigan Brewers Guild, celebrating 25 years of camaraderie. The Great Beer State Podcast shares the stories of our member breweries and the rich community of Michigan beer and brewing. Listen in, have a beer, and then check out mibeer.com for a full listing of member breweries, events, and more opportunities to explore and support the Great Beer State. Hello and welcome to Michigan's Great Beer State Podcast. We are here in Season 3, Episode 7. We've got some special guests from Michigan State University joining us today. I don't know what else. We're here in late spring, early summer as we record, starting to look forward to the Summer Beer Festival a little ways out. We had a wonderful spring beer festival in Traverse City. Scott, which of those things or anything else is on your mind as we look at the world of Michigan beer and Michigan Brewers Guild?
That's really where we are. We're coming into what I think will be a busy event season. COVID is kind of waned. I think lots of folks are ready to get out and be together. I think that there are overdue weddings and parties and different functions. It seems to me like there's a lot of plans in place and things happening. I think it's going to be a busy summer. And like you mentioned, we had our great first spring beer festival in Traverse City. It was really fun, beautiful day, tasty beer, had a really great day. We're looking forward to next May in Traverse City again with the spring beer festival. And now we're full steam ahead for the summer beer festival. And of course, that's our biggest and oldest first event. It's a ton of fun. It's in July at Riverside Park in Ypsilanti. It's towards the end of July, kind of culminates Michigan Beer Month. So yeah, that's what the Brewers Guild's working on.
Yeah, it was great to see everybody out and about. It was fun to kind of feel the location and get a feel for it. It reminded me of the early UP Fall Beer Festival where there was plenty of room, plenty of elbow room, as the first festivals usually take a minute to grow to full capacity. It felt lively and full, yet there was a lot of access for conversation and just, it was a beautiful day and lots of smiles. And the concourse kind of nature, there was this walk around the ballpark. So the brewers were spread out and it felt like very accessible because the foot traffic was just easy and you could turn around and see a brewery and get a beer or chat beer. All that seemed to flow really, really well.
Yeah, and I got that feedback from a lot of people. Folks really had a great time. So yeah, we'll chalk it up to a first successful event.
Yeah, and I liked it. Was different than other setups, I think, because it kind of had that circular feel. You could make the circuit and go around the entire thing. There was this sort of circular aspect that other festivals don't have, meaning you could just walk that path and keep going and you would see everything.
Yeah, and it's again, this is one of those partnerships that we have with the Traverse City Pit Spitters, and it's Turtle Creek Stadium. But having that infrastructure there, and being able to actually be inside of the ballpark, it's a beautiful setting. Helps with the hospitality and logistics to have their staff being part of the event and them, adopting some ownership and some of the logistics of people getting in, getting out, having parking on site. So it really is an enhancement to the event to have that partnership with the Pit Spitters.
Absolutely. Thanks to them and everybody that came out and supported. Seems like a good time to jump into the Brewers Dozen. We're in our third cycle through, if not more. Going alphabetically, we've reached the end of the C's and the beginning of the D's.
Yeah, and the point of the Brewers Dozen is to really try and mention our member breweries throughout the state. So we really want to encourage everybody to get out to your local brewery, to go to a brewery you haven't been to, take your friends, expose them. We really want to encourage engagement with people and breweries and build that community. And so we kind of run through this mention. If you hear something interesting or something that reminds you haven't been there in a while, we encourage you to go out to get together with friends and go have a fresh local pint and maybe a bite to eat and some conversation.
Yeah, it looks like we've got, even though this is sort of randomized through going alphabetical, we've got some old timers, we've got some newcomers, and we're covered north, south, east, and west pretty well on this list. So why don't you start us out?
Let's start with Charlotte Brewing Company in Charlotte. That's kind of southwest of Lansing.
We've got Sheboygan Brewing Company in Sheboygan, Michigan versus Sheboygan, Wisconsin.
Yes, Chelsea Ale House Brewery in Chelsea, which I think that's maybe you could call that the outskirts of Ann Arbor, way outskirts of Ann Arbor.
Yeah, a little bit. You've got City Belt Brewing Company in Grand Rapids.
CJ's Brewing Company in Commerce Township. That's the edge of the Metro Detroit area, kind of north and west of Detroit.
Yep, we've got Clam Lake Beer Company in Cadillac, which is sort of a nice sort of pivot between northern and southern Michigan in a way.
And Cold Iron Brewing Company in Ironwood is the western end of the UP, might be in the central time zone. I didn't check, but it's possible.
We've got Confluxity Brewing Company, which is in Portland, Michigan. And this week seems like our geography test, and Portland is a little bit east of Grand Rapids towards Alaska. So you've got multiple names known for other states there in that little corner. Beautiful spot.
Yeah, and Coopersville Brewing Company, back to the geography lesson. Coopersville is just a little west of Grand Rapids.
And we've got Copper Hop Brewing Company in St. Clair Shores, northeast of Detroit.
Dark Horse Brewing Company in Marshall.
And we've got Dead Bear Brewing Company in Grayling up in the UP.
And we'll wrap things up with Dearborn Brewing in Dearborn, home to Henry Ford, I guess.
There you go. All right. The trivia quiz has begun, and that's a good thing for us. Probably keeps us on our toes. So now we'll introduce our guests. We've got Dr. Rob Sirrine and Erin Lizotte from Michigan State University Extension, who are two of at least 3 to 4 member team or more that has supported us and collaborated with us, I think, in many different ways. You probably have the history even better than I do, but namely in these days was sort of merging and I don't know what the best word is, but they were hosts of and creators of the Great Lakes Hop and Barley Conference. And we integrated that material and planning into the newly named Michigan, the Great Beer State Conference. So they're educators, and they helped bring growers to the conference and bring education to both brewers and growers. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the history of that relationship with MSU and both Rob and Erin.
Well, this is a really interesting behind the scenes sort of story because it relates to agriculture. And of course, Michigan is a very diverse agricultural state. And historically, barley was grown here, hops some, but barley was grown more. And when this started to get reintroduced more than 10 years ago, it's a great story because of agriculture. I think there's strategic advantages to having local crops. We've got plentiful fresh water, which not every state has. But both barley and hops are worldwide commodity agricultural products, and there is an ebb and flow or to supply and demand, pricing, availability. And it's determined by worldwide weather and crop conditions. But MSU and MSU Extension, in the early days, I think it was called Michigan Agricultural College, but they've got a long history of all kinds of agricultural support. And these extension offices are free resources to farmers to tell them, this is what you need to do to grow this crop. These are the pests. This is how you apply pesticide. This is what's worked for other farmers. It's an incredible resource, and to have them dedicate some of their resources to hops and now to barley has been a tremendous thing for the state. And I think it's going to be years before it's widely recognized, but it's really a great and interesting story. And we're fortunate to have that as a resource. And it's really, I think fun and exciting to talk to Erin and Rob and, James and other folks that work on barley, and to have these conversations with some of the higher up administration at MSU. And they, there's a central lab facility and an educational program there, and there's a lot going on. But extension is the direct link with producers. And it's a very interesting story to see how there were, some fruit farmers that were interested. They became interested and wanted to know more. And then some people who just really had some passion and love of the beer industry and community decided they might want to get into farming. And how do I do this? And MSU Extension responded by saying, well, let's figure it out. And today we've got, worldwide experts applying, collaborating with other experts and applying their knowledge to our particular situation here in Michigan, which we're right in the band of latitude that is worldwide for growing hops. So we're not trying to force something in a region that can't support it. It's logical, and it's a great part of the development of our industry, or the long reach of our industry.
Yeah, and I think you'll hear more about that. And what interests me about this interview and this relationship too is I feel like there's this wonderful intersection that I think parallels the brewing world. Is there's basically the farmstead, homestead, home brewing story. There's the technological advancement story about how we were doing these things, in the early pre-prohibition era. Now we're doing these things with technical advancements that are often pointing to emulating some of the things we did before technology, but safer, cleaner, more adaptable in terms of, what in the hops world, whether that's breeding or pesticide. Brewing world, it's things like, centrifuge, filter, yeast management, all the things you didn't really have as much control of before the advancement. And then you've got the entrepreneurism story. I mean, there's so many parallels. It looks different. You don't see the hop brands or names necessarily at the bar, although sometimes you do. But there's been a very similar arc as they are part of this overall support industry that's grown as a result of and along with the craft brewing renaissance. And I think it's really interesting. Because in the 90s, there were some people growing hops, but it was pretty much in the Midwest, a cottage industry.
And of course, they've been wild all over the place because they're really a prolific grower. The plant really wants to grow. Now, to get it to produce and grow like you want requires a lot of inputs, but you can find hops all over the place. And indeed, some growers have gone out specifically and found like a wild variety, or I think Erin called it a feral variety. And I know from having these passionate conversations with at least one hop breeder or hop produce, that I'm looking for the word, but they make plants that hop growers plant. But he would go research the history of the farm and find out, these were German immigrants. This is probably a German variety, or, these people came from Poland. These hops probably came with them, looking back at the history of the farm plot.
Yeah. And in that way, it's even a different history than the beer styles and the brewers, because the plants have this family DNA that's still maybe living. So it becomes a little different, interesting sort of living history. And I like, when I mentioned the farmstead and homestead, which you'll hear them talk about, I think it also I wanted to say the second half of that is also points to that growing up nature of it's real industry, and we have some really, some people that have invested in the technology and the production capabilities to be, I don't know the best way to describe it, because I don't want to diminish qualitatively between the two, but being a producer for commercial customers has a different threshold in terms of stepping up your game. And commercial farming is different than gardening, whether you have a robust garden or not. And I think that's reminds me of the line between home brewer and professional brewer. You can be a really robust home brewer and have lots of technical advancements and be making killer beer. There's a difference between that and having a production brewer that's now shipping beer or open to customers 7 days a week, et cetera, et cetera. But I find that to be really interesting to hear them talk about. And especially since I have a little relationship to agriculture, having a horse farm and just being an agricultural country, I watch that line. I see so many examples of that it's interesting to me to see it in hops and barley, and to keep learning from it.
Yeah, well, at the risk of boring any listeners, I think we should get right into the interview with Erin and Rob.
Yeah, we'll get rid of the spoilers, or we'll stop adding any more spoilers. And this conversation was at the tail end of the Great Beer State Conference up in northern Michigan at Grand Traverse Resort in January 2022. Here's Erin and Rob. Cheers.
Cheers to MSU Extension. Thank you.
My name is Erin Lizotte, and I work for Michigan State University Extension, and I'm an ag educator, and I work primarily in pest management. So I work heavily on the production side with hop producers.
Yeah, pretty similar. Also, extension educator. Been with MSU Extension for 15 or so years, and Erin and I both work in hops across the state, and also lead the Great Lakes Hop Working Group, which is a kind of a collaborative of researchers and educators around the Great Lakes and northeastern region.
Can you talk a little bit about the history of hops in Michigan, both sort of historic and whatever modern day is? What's that look like in the state?
Well, in 1864, Fred, I'm just kidding. Actually, I have looked at some of the old USDA statistical bulletins, and I think there were around 400 acres. That was about the maximum in Michigan in the 1850s or 60s or something like that. And then, things have changed and everything moved out west. But the first hops, I think, since that time were planted in 2007 maybe, when there was that big shortage. And then and then we put on a program, and we didn't know anything about hops, so we brought in people who did, and then it kind of expanded from there, and more growers were looking to diversify their production. And without craft beer and the craft brewers in Michigan being the great beer state, it would be a whole different situation. So kind of that synergy has really helped kind of propel things.
I think one of the cool things about the history of hops in Michigan is you can still find hops on old farmsteads. So I think a lot of people mistakenly think they're grapes that are climbing up, Grandpa's barn in the back. But oftentimes those are actually hop vines because, of course, farms used to be pretty self-sufficient, and you made your own beer, you made your own cider, you grew your own food, and hops was part of that tradition that, mostly Europeans brought over from Germany and other regions. And so we find kind of feral hops. I would think of them as feral because, they were brought over by others and have gone wild. So we see them along railroad tracks and bike paths and on old farmsteads, and it's really neat.
That's a cool point, actually, because we were, back then, when they were moving across, from the east, a lot of the travel was by water. And there's so many islands out in Lake Michigan that have hops on them. As they're, coming across, they'd stop and bring their hops, whether it was on purpose or not. But there's hops on all the islands out out in Lake Michigan as well. That
Yeah, and they're,
cooler.
they don't go away easy.
No, that's true.
So when you're talking about sort of modern 2007 plantings, I feel like it's important to clarify, you're talking about like commercial planting with an intention versus, because
Good
I remember
point.
there were some hops in the 90s and stuff kind of grown by farmers, and brewers would get them, but it wasn't like this intentional industry yet.
Good point. Yeah, good point. And there's a huge learning curve too. So, you know, a lot of those initial growers try to develop their own systems instead of looking what worked out in the Pacific Northwest. And some, I mean, what did Brian call it? Brian Tennis called it the idiot tax, paying the idiot tax. You know, and half the people's trellises fell down because they tried to save money on wire and the spacing wasn't right. But I think now it's, you've had ups and downs and it's kind of stabilized, I would say. And the growers who are in it now are hopefully in it for the long haul.
And can you talk about the gap, that long historic gap in terms of either what caused it or, why did it go away and why is it ripe to come back?
Yeah, so that's an interesting history of the way hops came. It was like in Massachusetts. New York was a huge hop producer back in the day in the early 1800s. And then as people moved out west, they brought hops with them. Across Michigan, Wisconsin was actually fairly big. And then, disease issues came about. Kind of moved to California at first and then up into Oregon and into Washington and now we're about Idaho, I guess, too. And so that kind of also coincided with the Transcontinental Railroad, so they were able to grow the hops and then ship them back east. So I think it was a climate thing, and they just kind of moved to where the climate was the best for growing, and hops tend to be disease prone. In Yakima, it's a high desert, so they don't get a lot of precipitation. So it's probably one of the best spots in the world as long as they have water to grow hops.
And they didn't have robust pest management experts, perhaps, at the time.
Yeah, or robust breeding programs to select
point.
for, these markers. So, the solution was let's just move it to a drier climate where fungal pathogens particularly don't do well. And I think that's one of the things that's allowed the reemergence of our industry in the Midwest and the Northeast, where, we get a lot of spring rains, we get a lot of, in the infection world, we call them wetting events. But, now we have modern fungicides and couple that with host resistance in the form of these oftentimes public or proprietary varieties. And when you look at the differences between what we want to grow here and what they grow in Yakima, the biggest factor in that is downy mildew resistance versus powdery mildew resistance, which is their main priority out there. So it does come back to what we're capable of growing and growing well here.
And how many acres are commercially grown now by best guess estimate?
I think, probably 4 or 5 years ago, we're up to 800, and then it's kind of slowly dropped. It's probably around 400, we think, that are strung for harvest this last year. There are some new varieties being grown, so there's some, I would say, renewed interest in that sort of thing, just based on brewers always wanting what's new and unique. So probably around 400.
And can you share a little bit about, I'm curious as to how those first conversations happen. I guess it's first a question about agriculture and their relationship with the university in terms of commercial farmers. It's not a new idea to reach out for assistance. Because I just think, when did that first relationship start? And like people starting out, that beginning step towards saying, hey, let's work together between the extension and these farmers. And then the second part of that is, how has your relationship with the brewing community also informed that path towards supporting agriculture from your university point of view?
That's a good question. It was probably Annette, who was our office manager. We kept getting calls about hops because there was, some information in the news about the big hop shortage with the warehouse fire and poor yields. And people kept calling and saying, "Can we grow these here?" Like, I don't know. And then you look around, and you know, there's a pretty narrow band around the world where hops are grown, and it's right around the 45th parallel up to 50. We're like, well, we're right in the middle of that, so that's pretty cool. And Annette said, "Why don't you guys put on a program?" I'm like, "Okay." So we put on a program, like, oh, maybe get 20 people to show up, and then it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and there was like 150 people and 200, and then Scott Graham called me and said, "Hey, I was wondering if you could get me in there." I'm like, "Well, it's full." And he goes, "Well, I'm Scott Graham, and I work with the Brewers Guild." And I'm like, "Sure, we can get you in." And so from that point, we've just tried to invite him, and you know, kind of goes both ways, because we want our growers to learn from the people they're trying to produce the best product and sell their product to. And if the brewers can provide input to them that helps them be successful in the long term, that's kind of the background, I think.
Yeah, I think there were two kind of contingents that were interested in hop production. So at the time, Rob and I both worked in Leelanau County, and we were heavily involved in the cherry, apple, and wine grape industries. Those were the primary growers that we were supporting, and they're entrepreneurial by nature. So they said, geez, we're seeing people are getting really high prices on these hops, and frankly, they're used to growing difficult, perennial, high input, high value crops. Yeah. And so for them, it didn't seem intimidating to erect a yard of telephone poles and try to grow a new plant. And then we also had this contingency that were enthusiastic beer drinkers that I think maybe had an optimistic, maybe a little bit romanticized view of, you know, returning to the farm and producing something that would be part of the brewing scene in Michigan. You know, these were people that like to hang out at their local brewery, and they were really interested in hops. So I think, you know, we kind of had multi-generational ag producers, and then we also had people that were first generation stepping back onto the farm. And so it was a big challenge at the beginning, and a big resource for us was the partnership with the Brewers Guild. And it's great that Scott took that initiative to reach out initially, and since then has been really supportive. You know, I think Scott made the connections where now we have, you know, people like Alec Mull that provide service to our industry over and over again, and insight. And so, you know, for growers and for us, the Brewers Guild's been a critical partner from the get-go.
Yeah, it's been just ideal to have like some of the best breweries in the country
yeah.
in Michigan. That's been super helpful, and just the knowledge that those guys have provided to our growers, I think, has also been super helpful.
Yeah, and I like what you were saying. It brings me to another subject. I'm not sure exactly what the question will be, but when you're saying, we're talking about commercial farmers who are already used to risk management and inputs and outputs and things that the regular non-farming or sort of gardening, you know, home variety farm don't think about. Because I remember as a brewery person, for years, people be like, "Oh, you know, my uncle's got a couple acres over here, and I thought I'd grow some hops. What do you think?" And my cautionary tale was always like, "It's commercial farming.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to get some education. It's not planting tomatoes."
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And well, even tomatoes, growing them for home is different than
anything in Michigan.
than investing to make money from them. So
yeah.
I think where I want to take that is just if you know, if that call comes in and somebody says, "What's it take to grow hops?" Like, can you talk about sort of the benchmark investment, either time, energy, resource, like what would it take for a farmer to start growing hops, especially if they're not just transitioning from apples to hops or diversifying their acreage.
Yeah.
Somebody says, "I got this plot." Do you have thoughts or suggestions in that? Like, I remember seeing you guys had some dollars per acre or something like that.
Yeah, I think Erin's favorite question is, do you have a sprayer? And if they don't know how to answer that question, they should not grow hops. We have to spray these?
Yeah, we want to grow organic. It's like, well, we all do, but we don't have the toolbox yet for that.
You can do that in Yakima maybe, but it's really difficult here. I think Probably 3, 4, 5 years in, actually Ann George from Hop Growers of America were saying, hey, we've gotten some interest from folks in your region. We already have this cost of production guide for the Pacific Northwest. Do you guys want to develop one? And so we talked to Dan Wiesen, who was a grower at the time, and kind of went through all the numbers and put that spreadsheet up on, it's actually still on the website, I think. And you can, it's editable. You can go in and say, this is how much I'm going to make per acre. And all of the costs are in there. And pretty quickly when we refer people to that, unless they're getting like $18 a pound, it's going to be tough unless you put all that time, effort, and energy and kind of go in with both feet. I mean, it's real tough to make a big profit on 5 acres of hops. I think 20 is probably the minimum, but then you got to sell it.
And process it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the whole, in every step of the way, it's an investment. It takes time.
And it's a volatile market, like almost all agricultural specialty crops are. It's very high risk, and I think we probably do a better job now. Like sometimes we feel like we're a little bit doom and gloom with people, but agriculture today is it's about scale, right? Mm-hmm. So the fixed costs of a farm today are very high, and the variable costs are very high. And we're also dealing with things like climate change, which we feel the impact of that in specialty crops probably more than anything else, but especially perennial cropping systems where, we can't just replant the next year. The investments in timelines, so maturing that perennial crop, you lose that investment with plant death and freezes or things like that. And so I think the challenges are big. There's opportunity there, and we try to kind of balance those two messages. It's not a print and money type of situation, and we want people to make the best decisions for them. Sometimes we feel like we've had this conversation about chasing the dragon type of situation where people want to do hops, and then the next big thing is hemp, and right. Then it's going to be marijuana or these different crops, and there are opportunities there, absolutely, but there are so many unknowns. As the industries mature, things change. I think we're at a point in the Michigan hop industry where the industry is maturing. The people who are there have a scale that's going to work and a business model in mind, and a way to sell their hops and a network in place to support them. But it has been, I'd say, a painful 5 years for a lot of us as we've seen people exit the industry that, we had a lot of hope for those farms. So it's a painful process, I think, establishing a new industry.
Yeah, it's not like the cryptocurrency. Man, I wish I would have bought Bitcoin like 10 years ago. Wish I would have put hops in 10 years ago. And then what's the next big thing? You're not going to get rich in agriculture, probably ever in any crop. So I mean, there's that whole component with it as well. If you try to show the people the numbers, and then if you're still going to do it and you're passionate about it and you're persistent, those are the people that are still involved.
Yeah, and it seems like that might be adjacent to this other idea I have, or part of it is that, on the other hand, if it's diversifying an existing farm, and there are higher dollars per acre in terms of income, even though there may be risk and challenge and all the stuff that can take away whether that's profitable, but it seems like it's an alternative to balancing risk on the commodity market of, well, it's a higher dollar in than soy and corn. Mm-hmm. So it seems like it's both opportunity, but not without challenge to thread the needle. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm just asking you about, maybe you could speak to, in agriculture terms, the difference of playing the specialty crop market versus a commodity market, because that seems to be relevant to this game.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's some major differences. Typically, commodity markets are very established. There's not always price stability. I mean, we all hear about, beef or dairy, pork futures, yeah. Things like that. There's also historically been a lot more government support for the commodity markets. So they're seen as kind of economic backbones, and also as a food security issue for a country. And so there's a lot of support for that. Versus when you look at something like a tart cherry or a hop, that's not considered a regular part of the U.S. diet that, we need for food security. It's recognized as an important part of a diverse agricultural system, but historically we have not had things like crop insurance available for natural disasters or things like that. And so it's a huge financial risk for growers comparatively. But recently things have been a lot more volatile in both markets. So we're seeing the struggle of the American farm. That is a reality that is true for both. I think additionally the markets are more established for commodities. There's a higher number of growers. There's a geographical risk management that comes into play versus our 5-county area here where we grow most of the tart cherries in the U.S. If something happens in this 5-county area with weather, we lose market share for a muffin with Sara Lee or things like that. And so it's there's just the differences of scale that can really come into play between commodity and specialty crop markets.
Yeah, did you have more?
Well, I was just thinking about like there's also not in all commodity markets probably, but there's a buyer, a willing buyer there, where I think with some of these smaller scale hop farms, that's something you have to actively go out and work on. I mean, even in the Pacific Northwest, they have brokers that they're going to process their hops and sell them for them. Here, they have to work on, are you a grower? Are you a...
Is your hotel phone?
Pause for a second.
That's probably our pork futures guy calling.
Sell.
Can you give us a few more minutes? Okay, thank you.
Get out.
Get out. Yeah, you said. So, I don't know where we hit
Rob
off
was-
there, but talking about having a buyer.
Yeah, I think it's different. And that's what Dan Leeson would say all the time too. You got to get out there and sell it. If you leave 10% in your freezer, that's your profit margin. And so
There's no
what are you
grain
good
elevator
at?
for
right,
hops.
Right. What are you good at? If you're someone who loves farming, then you better hire someone else to do the sales for you. Or if you're someone that loves interacting with brewers, and you don't care about farming, you don't know, then maybe those two people should work together.
Yeah, and is
It's,
that starting to grow up in our hop industry in the state of Michigan? Is that infrastructure or relationships, is that part of what's developed over the last, I guess it's 15 years now?
I think so. I mean, even just in the last couple of years with COVID, I think things have changed, and that a lot of people were kind of optimistic on the upswing, and then that hit, and that's tough because the people who are buying their hops are some of the smaller scale breweries that don't have canning lines, don't sell to the grocery store, so they were shut down. So that has definitely had an impact as well. But I think it is. I think the market's maturing. What I was going to say was, we have this big, awesome processor up here in my local that pelletizes for a lot of the growers around the state, and that's kind of how it is out west. So maybe we're moving to that. You've had even a couple growers said, "Yeah, I don't want to ever pelletize again because it's just one more step. Has to be separated from the drying because it's considered processing." And there's different regulations under that they have to deal with, and they produce a super high quality product. So, maybe that's kind of the way things are maturing, and then, everyone's growing the hop, drying it, baling it, taking it to the place that does a lot of throughput. They have quality control in place, and they're going to do it well. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's an evolution. At the beginning, everyone wanted to be an island of one. They wanted their brand on everything. It was about their farm. The first thing I think people ordered were hats with logos and shirts with their farm logos. They wanted to be part of this scene. the exciting brewing scene and agricultural kind of revolution that's been going on, where people are going back to the farm, and that's kind of considered a job or career path or a lifestyle choice even. And so I think, that has been a big part of what people have wanted to buy into. And so thinking about the kind of not fun side of farming, which is spraying pesticides, paying bills, managing employees, processing the crop, selling the crop, all of those things have been difficult. And I think we've had leaders emerge in the industry that are really good at those things. And, it behooves everybody to work together and raise everything up together. So we're, a small, lean industry, and we're not even close to saturating the market, definitely not in our area or the Great Lakes region. And so, really there should be very minimal competition. This should be a group effort to put out the best product possible. And each step of that, system is a highly skilled set of, needs. So, I mean, the amount that a hop grower has to know from kind of cradle to pint with a hop is insane. And so, you got to look for those people who step forward and are better in those areas and utilize them.
It's a long-term process. I mean, Eric Demeray was even saying today, or yesterday at his talk, that 10 years ago or so, he was still screwing things up. And he's fourth generation, and they're still learning and adapting and making improvements. So, yeah.
And it sounds very familiar to the timeline of the Brewers Guild, where brewers, had to be born first and then figure out that we wanted to work together. And now we're celebrating 25 years of the Guild. What's your sense of what are the hallmarks of our brewing community that you've watched grow or that you admire or appreciate? And do you see that reflected in the aspirations of your hop growing community?
I've always been impressed with the way that you guys collaborate and share information, and it's just a super unique thing. And I don't know in agriculture if you get that a lot. But, people who like to sit on their tractor and not talk to anyone seem to be pretty independent and aren't necessarily the folks that are sharing information. It's seemed more of a competitive thing. But I think in the hard times, like we had a disease outbreak last year, and with COVID, I think it's just forced the growers to realize, we need to share information and work together. And someone the other day mentioned, well, look at the Guild. They're a perfect example of what hop growers of Michigan should be. I'm like, well, yeah, they've been around for 25 years though, and they've
Got hundreds
probably,
of members.
yeah, but you're right. I mean, that's what I would love to see is, and we've talked about this all the time. It's not just with hops, but with other crops as well. Trying to share information, work together, know where your strong suits are. If you're short, someone else has, too many hops, maybe you can work with them to still make the sale and keep the customers happy. So the brewing industry is definitely, something that we think the growers should look towards as a model. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you guys kind of came of age, like we're back in like maybe the baby days comparatively, and in the early days, not just in Michigan, but all over the place as microbreweries reemerged. The quality of beer was highly variable and most of it wasn't great, and so then you look at where we are now where, we had so many great beers over the last couple of days, and you could pick up almost any beer and appreciate something about that beer you're drinking, right? Versus the spit takes in the 90s and the early aughts where you drink something and say, oh, off flavors or, things like that. So, and that's through collaboration with the Brewers Guild and the Master Brewers Association and all of the work that you guys have done to educate people, share information, the mentorship that goes on within that group. And I think, we're really working hard to help our growers develop those same systems of support and collaboration. And it's not always easy. Everybody in both of these industries are really independent. I always joke that farmers are self-employed because no one else would hire them because they have their own ideas about how they're going to do things. And so kind of having that bigger perspective is important. And we do see that in other specialty crops. They work together, and it's out of necessity. So.
And that focus on quality that I feel like the craft brewers have just really tried to instill amongst their membership, but also like, you know, they expect the same level of quality from when they go out to the farm. And then, you know, really working with them to continue to define what that means, I think is super important for our growers. You know, what is a quality hop? You know, come and tell us, come and show us. I think that's been super helpful.
And can you talk about how that's reflected in what you are excited about, or what it means to come together and collaborate on this conference, and how this has developed?
Well, first
Yeah,
of all,
it's
I
awesome.
feel like just to be back in person all together, over a couple of years, at least from my perspective, it's a lot of phone calls, a lot of work that you're doing, but sometimes you forget how much you enjoy being part of this community, especially when we don't get together and have dinner and talk and laugh and all of those things. So for me, just being back in person with a group of people that I really enjoy seeing has kind of bolstered my excitement about my job again, instead of just like making pesticide recommendations and identifying
Over
insects
Zoom. Yeah.
over Zooms or FaceTimes or things like that.
Yeah.
So that has been really helpful. We've also been working together for a long time, but bringing this to fruition of everybody being under the same roof just makes so much sense.
Yeah.
And so it was just really exciting to share space with the industry all together. And I hope it provides opportunities for new partnerships and new networks and new resource sharing and all those great, and friendships and all that great stuff that makes your life worth living.
That's the key right there, I think, and Erin touched on it. It's the ability or the venue to establish the relationships, which is so hard to do over Zoom. It's just stupid. But if you're at the trade show and you're a brewer and, oh, hey, there's Empire Malt right there. I bought some malt from them. I'm going to go and talk to them. And then you walk around the corner and there's someone else. And the ability just to interact and form those relationships. And of course, the beer is awesome. And the food. So that always helps.
I think we knew it was big work, but I don't think we had the range of vision to understand what it was going to look like or how much of an impact it was going to have.
I mean, State of Michigan, Travel Michigan, Pure Michigan recognizes craft beer as one of their top 10, maybe less, maybe top 5 reasons people come to Michigan. It's part of our story.
Michigan is an anomaly in the country for how powerful the guild is.
When I first started, there was probably only 8 or 10 other breweries. See, when I went to try to learn anything, there was only one other brewery in the UP, which was Hereford and Hops. And that's the only other brewer I could go talk to at the time. So it was pretty kind of limited. That first Brewfest year changed everything. Craft beer is just totally accepted as the real beer now, and I think that's awesome.
I remember thinking how good I thought this was going to be for our fledgling industry, because people didn't really see us as an industry that had staying power. We're such a mature, established industry that people take so seriously.
We have to make this a qualitative conversation. You should engage with our products because they're an enhanced experience and that there's something to this.
Where I really got excited was, wow, this is the beginning of a whole new industry. Nobody's doing this.
It actually put brewers in each other's faces and to try each other's beers.
Different breweries adding 6 beers, 8 beers, 10 beers. You've seen as many as 20 to 30 different beers.
To have that connection where somebody feels like, I know somebody, we see it as such an opportunity to develop contacts and culture and knowledge.
Hey, look, there goes Joe Short, His name's on this. I get to say hi to him. People love that.
I'll ask questions and he'll tell me anything. Hey, where do you get your supplies? How long does what's the temperature range on this yeast? Anything from A to Z. And they answer all my questions.
I feel like we were a community of people that were really in love with what we were doing. That's what the guild's job was. It's like this is a group of people who got together for one purpose.
For a little engine that could think, we pull off a hell of a party, 4 times a year for a lot of people. And I'm very proud of the show that we put on.
just reaches out, and it just spread out, and it touched everybody. And it became a cool thing to do.
Congratulations on 25 wonderful years. We're going to keep growing, and here's to the next 25.